all aspects of labor and industrial relations with management people, labor people, government people, all kinds of practitioners, and possibly some comedians. We have a local chapter, the DC Labor and Employment Relations Association. We meet once a month. I should point out that in February, we will have Thea Lee from the Department of Labor. And in March, we'll have Ernie DeBester from the Federal Labor Relations Board, the authority rather, speaking, and we look forward to both of those. Today, we have the honor of meeting Professor Melissa Fisher, who will talk about the future of work in the age of pandemics and social movements. Melissa Fisher is a visiting scholar at New York University's Institute of Public Knowledge, an associate researcher in the Department of Social Anthropology at Stockholm University, a distinguished principal research fellow at the Conference Board, and an adjunct full professor in the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia. She has written a book which is well liked by the people of the world called Wall Street Women from 2012, which examines the first generation of women in finance. She's currently working on a book on the future of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace in the age of pandemics and new social movements. There is a complete bio in the list because Melissa has done way too much to summarize here, but is in the same document as the one I put in chat. So it's great to meet Melissa. I want to thank Emily Smith and Bernadette Tiemann in the national office who hold Lera together. Thanks to our local leaders. Welcome to all the people of the world who are here, the African Labor Law Society, members of National Lera, members in critical management from various countries, all of whom have logged on. So Professor Fisher will speak for about 45 minutes and there will be time for questions. So you have the floor, Melissa. Thank you very much for being here.
Great. And I'm just going to start with my screen. Well, thank you very much, David, for inviting me, and for DC Lera for inviting me to speak and talk with you today. So as I mentioned, or was mentioned by David, I'm a cultural anthropologist, which means that I pay attention to the ways that organizational structures and cultural ideas, symbols, and values about work, family, the meaning of life, success, shape our everyday lives, including our experiences at work, whether they're at the office, home, coffee shop, or factory floor. Indeed, during the past several decades, anthropology has studied the modern world and offered a wealth of insights for professionals, from business executives, investors, economists, activists, to political leaders, lawyers, computer scientists. Today, anthropologists are more likely to study Amazon warehouses than remote Amazon tribes. They've done research into and for institutions like corporations, including General Motors, Intel, Bankers Trust, and more, shedding light on practical applied questions, such as why pandemic work policies succeed or not. Let me give you a few examples briefly from my own work before delving into my talk today. My first book, Frontiers of Capital, Ethnographic Reflections on the New Economy, explored the social and cultural landscapes of business during this dot-com era. We were interested in how changes in technology, like the rise of the internet, were changing corporate structures and the workplace. My second book, which David mentioned, Wall Street Women, is a historical ethnography of the first generation of women in finance from the 80s to the financial crisis. There, I was interested in how women entered the white male-dominated corporate space of finance, how they climbed up the ladder or not, and what happened to them in the wake of the financial crisis. As it turned out, many, not all, resigned their jobs, thereby stalling out, or at the very least, reversing significant advancements in gender diversity in finance. My new book continues to focus on the world of work, namely the ways crises like the pandemic and new social movements like Me Too and Black Lives Matter are reshaping the gendered and racialized meanings of places and work, workers' sense of their identities, and their understanding of the purpose of work. So today I'm going to be speaking primarily from this ongoing research, but let me tell you a little bit about the larger scope of the project before I delve into the specificities of the work today, the talk today. When today's media workplace analysts and bloggers discuss the future of work in the age of pandemics, even 2 years in, they typically, as you already may know, emphasize the disruption in the place of work and the future of the office in the wake of millions, if not billions, of people working from home. This account is by far the dominant one. Central to the discussion is the home office, the use of technology in virtual or hybrid meetings, all realms in which the office no longer makes a difference or will be radically different in its purpose, and where the only type of worker that matters is largely the unnamed but obviously white professional or knowledge worker. This account privileges a corporate culture over the jobs in which it rests. In brief, it is about the predominantly white male-dominated transnational professional labor markets in finance and tech, rather than also the lower wage markets in factory, service, and gig work composed primarily of women and people of color, who in many instances, as we know, support the national and transnational labor markets. The work of janitors, maids, cafeteria workers, and nannies often appear to have little with contemporary discussions about the future of work, the more mainstream ones. Obviously, in the context of the audience today, I expect that's not the case. And yet, of course, as you already know, the pandemic has made visible the sharp divisions between essential frontline workers who must risk their lives by going to work and professionals who can easily avoid becoming ill by safely remaining largely working at home. Might the recent resurgence of political process, national and global, like Black Lives Matter, against racial, gender, and other forms of inequality, alter the structure of the labor market and exploitation of essential workers? Or might, and this is a deep fear of mine, the hyper-focus on the future of the office and knowledge workers reinscribe and reproduce existent gendered, racial, class, and ethnic hierarchies at work? These are some of the questions that researchers such as myself, along with the people here on the call today, need to address in the coming years, if not decades, given the massive disruption and reorganization in the structure of work and labor markets. Now, my goal for today and a short discussion is obviously quite a bit more modest, but it's against the backdrop of these questions and issues. I want to just talk about some of the current and near future of what the so-called future of work will look like and feel like. And specifically, I want us to think about how we can begin to navigate this new terrain of work and how we all might, in our various expertise, professional identities, contribute to creating more diverse, inclusive, and equitable workspaces across home, offices, and factories that take into consideration the experiences of workers of different genders, sexualities, race, class, abilities, and other forms of difference. The global pandemic has ushered in an absolute revolution in the meaning and the ways and places we work. Nearly 2 years, for the first time in modern history, work and family life for many, not all, is beginning and continuing in the wake of new variants to take place primarily in the home. Despite the switch to remote working, the physical office, the buildings, continue to be, although debatable, continue to be seen as spaces for interaction, collaboration, networking, as well as employees' wealth, health, and well-being. Businesses, as you already know, have been in a continual state of preparing what is continually being referred to as the purported new normal, with sudden surges forward and back, making the reopening and return to offices and factories and other places for organizations and employees an often dizzying and indeed deepening, disorienting anxiety for them. Indeed, as we know, the recent and current variant has once again upended the world's return to the office. In December in New York and London, where I know best, given my work on finance, firms such as JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and Citigroup asked staff to work from home. As firms continue to plan and rethink ways of doing business, it's clear that they not only need to reimagine and redesign the material and digital dimensions of workplaces and experiences, and how they connect or disconnect over space and time. No easy task. And organizations increasingly need to take a human-centric approach, right? An approach that really considers how are these changes across space, time, material, virtual, digital reality impacting people, employees, their understanding of themselves as workers, as parents, as people who are taking care of friends, whether that's working at home, in the office, or some combination of the two. And businesses also need to be taking a real, diverse, equitable, inclusive approach as they rethink the redesign. While the impact of COVID-19 has been felt everywhere, the direct impact on Black and Brown communities in the US, for example, is staggering. The pandemic, as I alluded to earlier in my opening, further exposed systemic racism, making business leaders and employees increasingly sensitive to racial and other forms of inequalities. The 2020 murder of George Floyd, followed by the recent resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement nationally in the US and globally, has forced increasing numbers of firms to implement new racial and social justice initiatives. A welcome development, and we of course get to see how these get played out. As organizations imagine, design, and plan for the restructuring of work, they really need to recognize, right, that the changes at work can impact individuals or different categories of workers in different ways, depending not only on their race and ethnicity, but their gender, socioeconomic status, health, and family life. So I would argue that now more than ever, we really need to take steps that strengthen diversity, equity, and inclusive workplace cultures wherever work takes place. So now I'm going to get a little bit more practical, having sort of opened up and set the scene. So to assist organizations with late pandemic workplace transitions, I used to call this post-pandemic, but I don't think that's going to be the case for a while. From what has now been largely remote to both hybrid and full-time office-based work. My talk today provides some practical actions to help people and businesses manage employee well-being, sense of safety, and ultimately productivity in the office and home, and 3 cultural trends impacting that world of work for the short term, and I would argue for the foreseeable long term as well, that are emerging. And this part of the talk comes largely from my work as a distinguished principal research fellow at the Conference Board, where we're much more focused on very practically oriented issues at stake, policy making. So the future of work is now. Let me just take a drink of water for 1 second. Taking an anthropologically informed approach, I want to identify at least 3 cultural shifts in the place, structure, and meaning of work, and then consider how these shifts are reshaping employees' experience, and pay then particular attention to the ways these changes may impact employees in different ways. And then I'm going to even drill down further and identify some short and long-term implications of each shift that, having spoken to organizations in DEI in a range of industries that are so far seen to be helping employees make the transition at this point from either predominantly full-time virtual work to full-time physical work in the workplace, or most often hybrid models. And all with an attention towards how can we think and how are organizations engaged in trying to strengthen and build diverse, inclusive work cultures. So first, the first cultural shift is when work becomes home and home becomes work. So the pandemic has upended not only where work is done, but how employees and workers think about home and work, right? It's a whole change in their sense of subjectivity, as well as workplace practices, experiences, and policies. Now, the interesting thing, as you may know, is that remote work, knowledge work in particular, is not new. It's been around since the 1970s. However, social scientists studying corporations, at least in the US, have historically found, while the majority of workers report that family comes first over work, they'll say that, right? Few historically took advantages of remote working or other family-friendly policies. And I found this to be the case when I was talking to women in finance in the mid-90s, when these opportunities became possible at firms like JP Morgan Chase. The opportunities were there, but nobody felt, they were so concerned about presenteeism that they didn't dare take advantage, right? And Arlie Hochschild's a cultural sociologist who looked at corporate America at the turn of the millennium found that to be the case too. She found that the office seemed to offer a stimulating environment, a sense of belonging for workers, and workers reported that home was just a place where it was too much to do. Now, today in the wake of the pandemic, particularly with the recent rise of variants, home, as I mentioned, still remains the primary or large place of work for many workers, particularly white-collar professionals. Yet workers' experiences, their feelings, their attitudes about working from home are shifting in profound and important ways, particularly over the last few years. So early on in the pandemic, in a surprising reversal from Holly Hochschild's informants, a large number reported they were satisfied and successful, right? The sort of grand experiment of working from home. For example, the April 2020, which was only a month or two into the whole grand experiment by workplace evolutionaries, revealed that 68% of their respondents felt, quote unquote, successful working at home, and 71% were satisfied with work activity performance at home currently on average at the time. Moreover, 72% versus 40% felt they were better able to manage distractions and interruptions, and 80% versus 63% reported thinking in more creative and innovative ways working at home compared to the office, which is fascinating. The long-term prognosis of the future of work, even 2 years in, is about home is more debatable, as is people's experience, sentiments, and emotions about it. Indeed, by the summer of 2020, in a study I conducted on the future of work on behalf of the conference board, my co-researcher Amy Yee and I began hearing far more accounts of employees around the world longing for chats by the coffee machine, the water cooler, the hum of their colleagues at work. And according to a June 2020 survey by the global financial services firm Jefferies, 61% of more than 1,500 UK respondents said they would return to work immediately if they could. When Matt Branberg, the co-founder of London-based People Collectives, which advises companies on human resources, polled his network of more than 5,000 HR bosses, he asked for the biggest reasons their teams had shared for wanting to go back to the office. 70% cited social and mental health issues, including feelings of loneliness. More recently, we are seeing a subtle but important shift in workers' experiences and expectations about work. Notably, the desire of remote and in-office work has changed somewhat since early days of the pandemic. According to a fall 2021 report on the state of remote work by OWL, Lab and Global Workplace Analytics, it's fascinating. 70 to 80% of employees want to work remotely or at least weekly. What is different now, 2 years into the pandemic, is that employers and organizations are more willing to let them and experiment with ways of doing, although they may not be entirely prepared for that and are sort of in a moment of grand experimentation about how that will be. So whether employees love the freedom from the daily grind, and now with the recent variant yet again, or multiple variants, fear commuting, which is a huge issue for employees to work by subway or bus, or miss the daily in-person interactions with their colleagues, or all of this, most workplace experts and most businesses agree that some form of working from home will continue. Now, this doesn't mean that the office will disappear, but that the return, as we know, is a smooth, seamless process. As one of my colleagues said to me early on, when we return to the office, we will be required, and we continue to require, to climb a very significant psychological step. Beyond this, I want to argue that what I'm calling the rules of the game at work for everyone, from the bottom to the top of labor markets and workplaces, have changed. By which I mean the everyday rules people formally and informally fashion, create in their everyday actions that govern their stances towards and interactions with their superiors, their subordinates, their peers and teams, their friends, their allies, and their rivals, their customers and how effectively they get work done. Which is to say that the rules that people fashion in their minds cognitively over time to guide their behavior at work on a sort of conscious and somewhat conscious basis have in effect at least partially been pushed up or are now up for grabs as a result from the shift from largely physically based work to working in a combination of material and digital space. More specifically, in the pre-pandemic era, if you will, the materiality of physical space was when most employees learned, right, via both formal and informal interactions, right, talking with bosses, getting formal training, afternoon lunches, and so forth, rules for what they considered survival and success. In fact, research on so-called new economy workplaces over the last 20 years prior to the pandemic demonstrated very vividly that workplaces served as key nodes for organizational communication and face-to-face interaction, even what was already a digital age, right? Because when I started to do my book on Frontiers of Capital 20 years ago, the sort of idea was that everybody was going to be on a laptop somewhere working easily. And that did not pan out to be the case. Space turned out to be, and place really mattered. For example, occupational practices, professional norms, and strategies of problem solving were shown to develop at work among employees in software firms. While my colleague Caitlin Zulum, looking at future traders, conferring across desk when strategically interpreting financial markets online dealing rooms. And what she found was how important it was, even in a digital age when traders were trying to mine the screen about what was happening, they used stories to interpret the number and share across desks what was happening, right? So that there was a kind of combination of physical and digital interpretation and interaction transpiring. All of these earlier anthropological, sociological, and organizational bodies of research really remind us that enormous numbers of people can technically work from anywhere, including at home, where that work matters for their productivity, identity, ways of working, and sense of well-being on the job. It is thus the decoupling of physical space from social space in workers' occupational lives that is creating so much of the anxiety, stress, disorientation, and uncertainty about what I'm calling the rules of the game in place at work. Indeed, one female financial manager in a global firm recently told me, based in London, that the more her employees, she said, the more that my employees are working at home, they seem to be forgetting or at loss about what the company's cultural ideas and values are. And in turn, she was distraught because she was telling me they are losing their sense of belonging and their loyalty to the firm, which, as we know, is in part creating what has now been dubbed the so-called Great Resignation, with people leaving. Workplace expert Kate Lister has discovered and pointed out in her survey research on hybrid work, with a portion of the workforce already coming back into hybrid work, that hybrid meetings are causing headaches. While 70% of workers say virtual meetings are less stressful than in-person ones, many report difficulty, right? They can't be heard, they don't feel engaged, and they miss vital bodily cues that are so important to reading physical meetings, such as facial expression. My ongoing interviews with women and other represented populations in finance reveal significant gendered and racial power dynamics at play in hybrid meetings as well, in which traditionally marginalized workers often feel even more marginalized and report feeling even less engaged in work than ever before. A number of them have talked to me quite extensively at feeling a kind of sense of occupational fatigue that accompanies this need to keep presenting their so-called best self every time they get onto a call, a kind of exhaustion in the re-representation of oneself, the fashioning of oneself as a professional being, and that moving from screen to screen is especially exhausting for them. All of these and other fraud experiences are causing a dramatic shift in diversity, equity, and inclusion in finance. Indeed, the pandemic impact on women and minority workers in finance, which is the area that I know best and I'm continuing to study as part of my book and some thought leadership, is really quite alarming. The overall progress of both groups has historically been slow. A study at the onset of the pandemic found that executive levels consisted of 29% women and 70% men. Even more starkly, whites made up 21% of the executive suite. The pandemic has been a disaster for women. A fall Accenture survey revealed that 29% of women working in finance left their jobs either permanently or temporarily during the pandemic in finance, and that more than a third of women who had not resigned said they were considering doing so. So now progress towards my diverse, equitable, and inclusive financial firms and markets could be stalled, or worse yet, reversed. And I started my talk out about concerns about racial equity at the bottom and the top, gender equity of the labor markets. But let me point out that it's not just about having an internal, diverse, equitable financial culture locally, nationally, and globally. The ongoing loss of women and minorities from finance, particularly from leader positions, can also have a deleterious impact on the global economy and society writ large, which is why I argue we should be concerned. Research shows that diverse and inclusive businesses are associated with lower market volatility, better outcomes in risk management, and higher rates of productivity. Indeed, the financial crisis also exposed the costs that a white male-dominated excessive risk financial culture and short-term focus can inflict on society. Despite rapid recoveries, this culture proved particularly damaging in the US, the UK, and elsewhere, exacerbating existing class, gender, and racial inequality, along with rampant wage, income, job, and retirement insecurity. So, how can companies in finance and other industries help their employees work successfully from home or in a hybrid fashion, including hybrid meetings? Let's drill down a little bit for now. First, they can improve the well-being of remote workers by enabling an ergonomic home office, right? Ensuring that employees have access to everything they need to be successfully working at home. So for example, TD Bank early on implemented short-term guidelines to support the ergonomic needs of remote employees, and even conducted virtual ergonomic assessment upon employees' requests and shipped proper furniture like chairs, desk, and keyboard. Early on, Google announced it was giving each employee $1,000 to equip their home offices, followed by Shopify, Facebook, Twitter, and other companies. Now, of course, not all employees work for Google or companies that will receive $1,000 to fund their office expenses. In the context of the United States, states including California, Massachusetts, Illinois, Montana, and New Hampshire have already mandated some levels of reimbursement by employers for job-related employee expenses, which is a good thing. Now, the question is, right, is how far other states will go to address this new normal? That remains to be seen. And legal experts anticipate, not surprisingly, a wave of lawsuits and reimbursements by remote or hybrid employees looking for more assistance and reimbursement from their companies. So it certainly behooves companies to be rethinking their home office reimbursement policies and practices. In the long term, other solutions really need to be created, including government strategies and subsidies for home offices, right? I mean, many of the arguments I'm making today are coming out of, corporate policies, workplace policies, but, the larger issue, of course, is that the reasons that governments are in play is that states have sort of been absent to address in many of the kinds of needs. And in the case of the US, I mean, the sort of demise or dissolution of what was a welfare state is clearly what we're seeing unravel in so many multiple ways and places that are devastating. Another way to think about addressing the needs of a diverse workforce is to really, ensure that people have proper technology and broadband at home, to also consider what it means to be logging in, whether people should have a background or not, As one person said, you want to have sort of not just the background of, I have a background to sort of, as we know, many people now sort of, reshape what their background is. But as one D&I professional pointed out early on in the pandemic to me, diversity, he said, is also about giving employees autonomy in using the video feature. The camera is a window for the meeting participants to look through others' living situations. Not everyone is comfortable sharing their private life. So employers really need to think about ways of eliminating potential indicators of difference by, for example, requiring all employees to use a simple backdrop in digital space. Now, of course, alleviating all signs of home life may not be possible, or in some ways, if we think about it, even advisable. As Colin Ammerman and Boris Groysberg, two scholars of gender and inequality, pointed out in a Harvard Business Review article, with employees' families' lives being highly visible, it's critical to be aware of the divergent biases towards fathers and mothers. It's important that individuals and businesses understand that remote or hybrid working does not occur in a vacuum. Business leaders and employees need to take adaptive steps to challenge any embedded assumptions about the gendered normative roles of mothers and fathers, so that these norms do not drive the ways that managers and colleagues perceive remote working by men and women and what they expect of them. This means, for example, that they need to make sure that women's competencies are not questioned, or any parent competencies, but it happens to be often on women's shoulders, are not questioned on the basis of their caregiving roles on and off camera. It's possible that it may behoove male and female leaders, parents, to take an active role in talking about, even showing how they are juggling or struggling with work and family. Finally, moving back to what I said earlier, this idea of how do you take a human-centric change management approach to changes in work. Workplace strategists, experts from Plastar, a workplace innovation and real estate strategy firm, argue that the key to successfully implementing change is to engage employees as genuinely and authentically as possible. A people-centric management approach entails a democratization of what has previously been conceived as primarily a top-down process. As one human resource leader of a US-based global chemical company explained, as a human resource leader of a company, these decisions should not be forced down upon employees. Instead, they need to be highly involved in the decision-making process. And research after research and study after study in the last 2 years has shown that as employees work more at home, they want to have a sense of autonomy and choice, right? That's very much sort of an increasing part of their identity and their sense of what they desire from the workplace. So one way that the global company is accomplishing not moving from a top-down perspective, is to conduct virtual focus groups and sometimes in-person focus groups with its employees to help them to redevelop the hybrid of work, right? So there's much more ongoing engagement on multiple levels. Some are also leveraging frequent pulse surveys to understand employees' needs and sentiments, trying to figure out how they're working, surveying them, finding out when the pressure gets too much and excessive and what should be done. And a number of financial firms, again, in the work that I do, are conducting what they call courageous conversations, with the goals of providing physical and digital spaces for employees to speak freely about the difficulties they are encountering engaging in new ways of work. Of course, not all employees feel comfortable freely speaking in the context of their firms, leading me to believe that it's increasingly important for outside organizations and professional associations to develop opportunities for such conversations. The Conference Board, where I have an affiliation, for example, has several DEI initiatives and work groups that come together on a regular basis and follow the Chatham House rules, enabling to share the stresses and the joys of the DEI work they do and share best practices. And I think that's a very effective tool to be used. What will it take for employees to feel safe emotionally, physically about returning to the office? And I'm going to focus on the last two cultural shifts, but take a little bit less time so that We're just aware of time for Q&A. For some time, corporations have been witnessing a mindful revolution, right? Boasting high-end amenities from predominantly knowledge workers, wellness, gyms, spas, power nap places, pods. The effect of this mainstreaming of wellness into the workplace is debatable. Indeed, as management scholar Ron Purser argues, a focus on primarily individual mindfulness can distract from societal causes of stress and anxiety. Today, in the wake of COVID-19, a second mainstream mindful revolution is underway, one that focuses in theory and hopefully on the more systemic effects of everyone engaging in safe, mindful, and sustainable work practices. A shift in business from focusing primarily from so-called personal to social wellness. Of course, the idea of social wellness is itself not entirely new. It involves building healthy, nurturing, and supportive relationships and fostering a genuine connection with others. So social wellness translated into the workplace when done well can mean many things, such as the recognition, right, that the interior physical environment can be a catalyst for social connection and well-being. And as companies now move into bringing workers in to hybrid work, it translates into their readjusting and redesigning the workplace to ensure workers' physical and emotional sense of safety and well-being. In giving them workplace training and behavior, not an easy task, especially given the increasing political turmoil and divides we see between the believers in vaccines and the anti-vaxxers. So what are some of the ways that companies can restructure office spaces and make them ready and safe for their workers? How can they support their physical and mental well-being? Let me just give a few suggestions, again, drilling down to some practicalities we found. Retaining a diverse and inclusive work environment when redesigning the office. As companies implement social distancing and new safety protocols, they should make sure not to inadvertently exclude women, people of color, LGBTQIA, people with disabilities, and older workers from career advancement. As businesses redesign the office to make it, for example, purportedly more collaborative, it is important that they place, for example, women, people of color, and others in areas that are not place them in areas that are less visible to clients or bosses and team members whom they work with on a daily basis. Businesses should also consider training their employees in identifying and dealing with microaggressions, especially, but not only those take place in the physical office. Notably, a number of the women of color I have spoken in a number of industries have told me recently that they prefer working at home, even full-time, because they do not want to deal with the daily onslaught of microaggressions they typically encounter at work. This is also a really disturbing development, as opportunities for key job assignments, knowledge of business opportunities, and building informal mental relationships often happen, at least still, in the physical workplace. Microaggression is a subtle way of showing one's bias and discriminating tendencies. Any statement, joke, inappropriate inquiry, alluding to someone's gender, race, or even age can be seen as a microaggression, especially if it's said in the context of one's weaknesses. Microaggressions can take place anywhere, including especially the physical workplace. Maintaining extra social distancing from a colleague of color, for example, can be interpreted as a subtle form of racism. So diversity and inclusion professionals can help people correct these behaviors by bringing attention and awareness to the issues and, again, creating safe spaces for employees to discuss them. I won't go into it, but of course, as you probably know, there's an extensive amount of research going on and programs being developed for mental, social, and financial well-being. And one of many sort of things that we see arising that I see as a positive development is the rise of diversity and inclusion in telehealth, in which companies are employing healthcare providers who work towards effectively delivering healthcare services tailored to the social, cultural, racial, gendered, and ethnic and linguistic needs of their patients. Last cultural trend, how to create an inclusive, diverse, equitable work culture everywhere we work takes place. Traditionally, companies have built strong corporate cultures in the physical office or factory floor. As cultural historian Angel Pollack-Poland argues in her study of the insurance industry, historically, the office has provided physical enclosures of boundaries for office behavior and spaces where values, beliefs, and ideas shape and define employees' work experiences. Offices also provide a physical environment for people to connect with one another by working together, attending meetings, brainstorming together, eating lunch, coffee. These occasions not only help employees to work efficiently and productively, which is important, they also enable individuals, as I've alluded to throughout the talk, to spontaneously build key relationships with one another, formally and informally, and mentors who can facilitate career advancement. Moreover, employee and resource groups organizing in-person events provide additional physical spaces for workers who share characteristics, life experiences, identity, to come together and help each other navigate the workplace. For some time now, anthropological research has shown that designing virtual workplaces based on physical work is not a unilinear or easy process. For example, creating virtual places where employees can experience the same kind of proximity to their colleagues can be challenging. Workers, especially women and people of color, may also find it difficult to find informal mentors or feel connected to their ERG members. How can businesses maintain and build a strong, diverse, equitable work culture? What virtual technological tools are in place? Let me again just drill down to 3. Many of the organizations I've spoken to over the past 2 years are deliberately promoting firm-wide events and regular departmental check-ins as a way to enhance and create a cohesive sense of organizational culture and building. For example, at TD Bank, over 120 participants recently celebrated the International Transgender Day of Visibility virtually. Second, building diverse and inclusive environments online by relaunching different kinds of training. You know, microaggressions not only take place, as I talked about, in physical space, but digital space as well. Given this, many organizations are actively launching and relaunching unconscious bias, emotional intelligence, and inclusive leadership courses, which help employees and leaders to deepen their understanding of these constructs in now virtual or hybrid work environments. Due to the pandemic, it's taken even greater urgency in the wake of increased attention to racial and other forms of inequality in and out of the workplace. So training can include tools and tips, for example, about helping to eliminate your bias that remote workers, such as working mothers who choose to work primarily at home, are less productive. Businesses are creating new protocols for behavior in online meetings. One female professional told us that her company shuts down the chat function, which is interesting, in virtual meetings to keep mostly male individuals from engaging in private conversations and connections, to ensure that everyone has access to the same information and no one is left out. Finally, creating opportunities for virtual and diverse, spontaneous human connection, which I think is probably the most challenging, right? A number of diversity experts have told me that while their employees enjoy the various virtual activities initiated by organizations and teams, many still feel that it's the spontaneous contact with coworkers outside of their immediate teams, the so-called water cooler talk, the hallway conversation that has decreased dramatically. Given this, some businesses are working towards creating more spontaneous interactions by holding online virtual cross-departmental events and leveraging new kinds of technology. And new forms of technology are being developed all the time. The COVID pandemic has, for example, significantly prompted the adoption, interestingly, of virtual reality and augmented reality technologies as business return to remote work. And we have yet to see how is that going to work out? What are the racial gendered implications? So in conclusion, my talk has briefly shown how 3 cultural shifts are transforming the structure, meaning, and place of work in the age of pandemics and social movements. when work is becoming in some capacity home and home work and all sorts of fluid boundaries there, from a sense of personal individual wellness and to social wellness in the workplace, hopefully, not clear, and to thinking about ways to redesign, reimagine strong, diverse, equitable, inclusive workplace cultures wherever work takes place. For the long term, organizations need to consider the long and short term impact of these arrangements on employees' sense of community and feeling a part of the work culture, as well as how the new organization and restructuring of work will affect diversity, equity, and inclusive efforts. Anthropologists of both factory and professional work have shown the importance of rituals, celebrating co-workers' birthdays, promotions, and other milestones to workers' sense of workplace community and productivity. What will be the impact on company culture, camaraderie, and productivity as factory workers' shifts no longer see their fellow workers and friends between shifts because of regulations in terms of the pandemic and health, right? So what is happening to those connections? What will happen if more diverse teams are not able to interact with less diverse teams at work due to work rotations? What will the impact of long-term social distancing have on gender, racial, and other relations and structures of power in the workplace? Answers to these questions, obviously, as I've been arguing throughout the talk, require long-term research, but companies need to and are already considering how these issues need to be addressed as they restructure their work in workplace. Now is the time for companies to reaffirm and rebuild their communities and commitments to diversity, inclusion, and equity efforts. Traditionally, diversity and inclusive professionals have not been engaged in certain dimensions of workplace planning. And this, I think, is really important, including most notably the actual design of the interior and exterior, physical and virtual environment, right? It's been left to architects, it's been left to corporate realtors. What we really need today in the age of pandemics and rising attention to workplace inequality is for the silos that exist in companies in multiple ways. This is just one example. For companies to really work with diversity and inclusion officers in an effort to create safer, more diverse workplace, physical and digital work environments. Also, in thinking designing more equitable post-COVID workplaces or late COVID workplaces, we need to resist the temptation to look for quick design fixes that narrowly define the frame as only public and health safety that can be easily remedied by seemingly objective parameters and solutions. Instead, we need to think about how to reimagine work and workplaces within a broader historical, political, social, and cultural context, as well as to take into consideration workers whose experiences and needs are often, as I began this earlier talk, left out of the mainstream conversations. The cleaners that will have to make the offices safe and hygienic, the cafeteria workers that continue to serve office workers, the truck drivers that deliver computers and other equipment to financial services and other companies. So I just want to end by reiterating and just developing a few suggestions and cautionary points as we move forward, and taking a little bit from sort of an anthropological lens and perspective. First, scholars, policymakers, lawyers, activists, and others engaged in understanding and designing the restructuring of work need to take a far more systemic approach to businesses and organizations to avoid what I see as the current tendency to focus far more attention on the future of office buildings, knowledge workers, and spaces. So here I want to suggest that businesses or organizations should not be conceptualized or studied as isolated organizational structures or forms. Instead, as my colleague, pioneering organizational anthropologist Marietta Baba, drawing on new institutional theory, points out, businesses, especially global businesses, should be understood as what she calls institutional fields. Institutional fields composed of organizations and actors, including, for example, firms, factories, suppliers, executives, support staff, and beyond, connected in the myriad of ways in physical, digital space and time. And I will tell you that I recently met with a host of workplace experts in change management who work largely out of corporate real estate and facility management, and emphasize the importance of not only talking in their workplace consultancies to knowledge workers, but to the janitors. And it seems that this discussion have made some kind of impact on their thinking. How it ends up in, and whether or not they actually do it, I don't know, but I am trying to, rather than use an analytic term of institutional fields and so forth, academic firms, just pointing out the importance of looking at labor markets, workplace structures, businesses as these kinds of institutional field composed of multiple players, institutions, and spaces that are connected and disconnected, right? And how it actually works as a system. Then we can think about how those systems are gendered and raced and how they are done so in multiple places. I just talked to a global company that's a toy company concerned about what's happening as they kind of try to expand their diverse, equitable, and inclusive work culture in multiple places and factories in the US, in parts of the global South, right? So these are really important kind of tools and techniques that can be used not only in academia, but also as activists, designers, diverse equity people think about. Second, and relatedly, we really need to continue to be aware of the possibility and likelihood, at least now, of the pandemic's potential to reinforce structural hierarchies in the labor market and workplace rather than transform them. Although we also have an opportunity, clearly, as we have conversations like we have today, to transform them and disrupt them. The labor market is already deeply divided by a transnational, as I said earlier, predominantly white professional male labor market that is buttressed and supported by a lower level labor market composed largely of women, people of color, people from the global South, all kinds of inequities. In imagining the future of work, we need to consider the experiences of all workers in all kinds of environments. Lastly, we need to design workplaces, the office, the factory floor, wherever work takes place, that are designed for all kinds of bodies, abled and disabled, cisgender and gender fluid, and so on and so forth. The current moment of social movements and political protests is shining a light on the various inequities embedded in the social and built material and virtual environments of work. While I do not have the space or time to talk in great detail today, I do want to give a shout out to the critical work being done in the area of social justice, inclusive and decolonizing and deracing design in areas including architecture. For too long, our workplaces, particularly offices, have built with the image of the white, able-bodied professional workers in mind. In the wake of the pandemic, we are all experiencing, exactly, in a sense, what it means to be less or differentially abled, to have fears and concerns about spacing, what we see and don't see, what we can touch, what we can breathe in, what we cannot touch and breathe in. Perhaps our heightened awareness of ourselves and others will create openings for my diverse, equitable, inclusive structures and spaces for work as we move forward. I certainly hope so. And now I want to open it up to Q&A and conversation. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you so much for this very interesting, provocative presentation. Covers so many aspects of a very complex question. And I like the way you wove together so many dimensions of anthropology and aspects of the workplace. I'm reminded of my father, who was an anthropologist. I told him once, I didn't think I was going to my graduation. And he said, David, I'm an anthropologist. I believe in rites of passage. And I now agree with him on that question. So we have a question from David Schlein. David, you want to come online?
Yeah, it would be great to see people to talk to you, as having now discussed the sort of challenges of doing things Zoom.
Right. David?
Okay,
Well,
can you hear me?
yes, there he goes.
Great. So I'm wondering if you have considered or would now the implications of this change for the unionized workplace. How can unions continue to represent and organize workers in the changing workplace that you're talking about?
I mean, I think that's a really good question. And looking at unions is not the area that I focus on, particularly in the context of the financial services industry. So I don't consider myself an expert on that. I think that bringing in ideas about sort of an understanding, as I just finished the conversation, about the need to think about multiple forms of injustice and inequality in the workplace, so that unions represent, gendered, fluid, cisgendered people, able, disabled, all kinds of representatives. I think that also we need to think about how unions or union-like associations can be created in ways that are beyond exclusively, that are in places where workers are not necessarily unionized, right? And work together. For example, I mean, executives, people of color in finance do not have a union, right? Or a kind of professional organization. So I think that also trying to think about what are the possible kinds of organizational forms that can better represent justice and work with people in the workplace writ large, kind of expanding our ideas about those possibilities also needs to be taken into consideration, right? And what does it mean, about sort of as people are moving in material and digital space, what does it mean for, again, for unions to meet? What does it mean to meet in digital material space? Who is being represented? Who is being talked to? I mean, who's being left out of unions, right? Gig workers and so forth, right? That do not necessarily have the opportunity to be engaged in more formal structures. How can we begin to think about social justice and other kinds of professional initiatives that will encompass an increasingly wider and dispersed numbers of individuals in the labor market that may not even be able to take advantage of being part of unions?
Melissa, that brings up an important point that I think we'll be addressing in a later DC Lera meeting. I think we're going to be having some chats about gig labor, gig employment, and what forms of worker representation might be arising in that context. Thank you very much. Thank you, David. Any more questions from the audience?
Yeah, I have a question, David. Thank you, Melissa, for your talk. So just, one comment and one question. So comment is that I think you're absolutely right. The gendered angle really needs to be looked at very carefully. So we obviously can't speak of workers in a homogeneous manner, so especially in a country like India, which is highly patriarchal and highly masculine, where people are socialized to believe that, the man goes out to work and the woman, if she does go out to work, she's still the main caregiver and homemaker. So in fact, that the president of India, he just recently did an interview. He was quoted in an article saying that work from home during the lockdown, it put a threefold pressure on women. It was one, they have to look after their work, they have to look after their household, family caregiving activities. But then the children were also working, studying online at home, isn't it? Mm-hmm. So to be the parents who would make them sit and get their homework done and all that. So he spoke of a triple pressure on women. So that's just one comment. My question, it's kind of a suggestion question. I totally agree about informal spaces. And when I looked back in the last 1 year of lockdown, I thought, what did I miss most? So even though I'm more introverted as a personality, but I did miss the water cooler talks, because you'd meet people from different departments, get to know what's happening. It even led to a book together with another professor of another department. It leads to things that, are totally unplanned. So I'm a great believer in that. But I don't think it's difficult to do, like say, for example, before this session started, we just came up a little bit early and we had an informal chat, isn't it? So don't you think this could be ramped up quite quickly by various organizations, having an informal space, having a virtual drink together, or, something like that?
Oh, I absolutely do. I have no question that that's happening, that in fact, we had the informal conversation. You're absolutely right. I just, it depends on who is willing and making the effort individually and collectively to come online, right? Or to create and be part of those so-called spontaneous conversations. You can never, I think, fully replace. It's not just the places of spontaneous conversations, the water cooler, but it's also the places in which, private conversations take place. Early on, when I did work on financial trading floors, where, it's mostly white men, many of the women told me that they ended up in, for better and for worse, in the restroom as the place where women would talk privately and sometimes cry about what was happening. So I don't know how well, and I think that people are working on augmenting virtual reality. I don't know how well we can design and reimagine not only the water cooler, but also, sort of the private spaces and moments that people informally in the workplace congregate and find to have, quieter conversations away from public forums. So absolutely, we're going to have to, and we absolutely are trying to create, spontaneous conversations. But these kinds of, by accident moments in which, you're on a cafeteria line, something like that, and you overhear a kind of conversation, you hear about, you join workers about talking about a workplace initiative, right? Those are the kinds of things that really concern me. And historically, women, people of color, again, in the context that I know best, financial services industry have felt, removed from, right, both informal and formal places of conversations. For the first generation of women on Wall Street, they couldn't even belong to some of the white male clubs here in New York. So yes, absolutely, we can develop and design things, but I am not yet convinced that we will fully be able to create the kinds of spontaneous environments unless we move into a so largely exclusive virtual way of working that that these kinds of things are replicated, and perhaps that will take place. There are so many key issues in the context of workplace engagement. In the world of finance, the issue of building trust and face-to-face interaction has been shown time and time again to be of significant importance. How people build trust again and maintain trust, not only in finance and workplace environments, is a key question for me. And especially if it's the case where, women at very high level positions have maybe a harder time developing trust relationships, is of concern to me as well.
Thank you for the question and for the answer. More questions from the audience, please. Who else is there? Wants to go online or either put something in the chat? While you're thinking about that, let me ask a question, Melissa, which is, I'm a little worried about the dystopian future, which is that the economic pressures and the opportunities provided by technology move us to a far too virtualized workplace, and that we are not able to create the hybrid that makes sense in personal terms. And let me just indicate what the extreme is. The extreme is Facebook Meta, obviously, in which enterprises stop investing in physical structures and we're under surveillance constantly in a virtual sense. So how do we stop from the worst possible outcome?
That's very dystopian. Well, I actually don't think that's going to happen because, if you look at sort of the ways that companies are thinking and investing, people are at the moment, so concerned about the investment in physical capital and space and downtown headquarters and the return to work and arguments. One of the key, why are so many people in workplace strategy, corporate real estate, making arguments about the importance of the physical workplace? Their arguments may be well argued and correct, but of course it's because of the need to create and maintain investment, right, in physical spaces and downtown buildings. You have only to look at New York, right? The downtown buildings that were built prior to the pandemic, the ones that continue to be built in headquarters. So I do not necessarily see that we will be barring, something far worse in terms of a variance that we are encountering, I see the likelihood of all work becoming virtual, or largely office work as not something that will happen in the foreseeable future. But the issue is more to the effect of, I didn't talk so much about concerns about surveillance. I mean, I alluded to, employees being more involved in their employees' work at home. But this issue of increased surveillance and encroachment in your personal space, I think is really, really a critical one that needs to, and I think isn't being investigated increasingly.
Thank you, Melissa. Any other questions? Looking in the chat.
David, I have one.
Oh, Mindy.
Yeah, thank you. This was wonderful, Melissa. So many important points. I've just been reading a splendid book called American Made, What Happens to People When Work Disappears. I don't know if you're familiar with that, Melissa, but it's fascinating. This woman went to a closing factory in Indianapolis and recounts the stories of several people. But the question I wanted to ask is, you mentioned communities that in a perfect world would understand each other, the different perspectives, the different needs, but the reality is they don't. So how then do we try to bring together people who ideologically might not be very supportive of people from the transgender or queer communities, people who don't understand people who don't prioritize faith, people who are feeling that the white upper middle class has no concern or even interest in their livelihoods? You've touched on this, and we have structures, inclusion, diversity, equity, but often it's rhetoric. I wish you'd talk a little bit more about what you see as the best initiatives in these areas.
I'm actually going to make an argument for an anthropologically informed way of working. I think you're right that there's a lot of whitewashing, pinkwashing, kind of woke capitalism at play, in which many efforts, as well as best intentioned, are not working, right? So, I mean, one of the things that I try to do in the consulting practice that I do is trying to create people's awareness of that it's not just about individual difference, but trying to make them understand that it's the underlying structures of power and gender and race that create the differences between people. And that's a very kind of abstract way of trying to make workers understand, what is going on. But it does provide a kind of space to create certain kinds of conversations. I do not think this is an easy task, because I think that we work in, we work and live in societies that are increasingly divided, right? In which, I mean, the white labor market may feel under assault, for example, right? That doesn't want to actually deal with these kinds of things. I don't think, so I don't think that all the kinds of training has really been properly developed at this point. I can't really point to that many outside of the times in which I've been in spaces in which the understanding is, and this is why I said it's difficult to do internally in workplaces, where it's outside of the workplace, where people from a range of different institutions and workplace experiences and occupations come together to have conversations that are completely off the record and have no impact on their work life, right? And it's only in those spaces, and to share best practices. In this case, I mean, again, these are already talking to the people who already are part of the understanding diversity, equity, and inclusion officers. But it's often in these kind of, spaces away from publicly open spaces that I see any kind of discussion being leveraged. And my heart goes out to people working in diversity, equity, and inclusion who are engaged in the, really trying to change the needle, right? Really trying. And I mean, one of the important things I think about having these structures and opportunities is for them to just talk about the stresses that accompany that kind of work. especially in the current political environment that we live in, which is, I mean, we live in a society and locally and globally that's, between a kind of Trumpian, borderline fascism. No, I mean, essentially, right? And then the rise of an increasingly attentive population to these kinds of inequalities. It's a real kind of back and forth, and it's being played out on multiple levels. I don't have any, at the moment, any great solutions that I see. Do you have any that you've seen?
No, but I think the holistic, you use the word anthropological approach is really critical to see the broader parameters, the interlockings that we don't think about, the connection between supply chains and their implications for the worker. Again, people are often in their little bubbles, and we need to expand the bubble to the world. Let me just conclude by saying some astronauts have looked at the fragile Earth from space stations. That's helpful. Those sort of global images and our precious and fragile place in the universe, that might push a bit.
Right, and I will say that one of the things that I've been asked to do, for example, the US Embassy had me take a tour throughout Germany to try and help people think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and women leaders. One of the things I had people do is literally map out their networks, who they knew, who they worked with, and the gender dimension and the racial dimension about who they worked with, who are their part of their families, and so forth, so that they could actually, as you're saying, so it's another kind of macro map that people can actually do, right? So of course it begins to show people, oh my goodness, almost all my work colleagues are white, male, or whatever, right? And not only that, I mean, if you bring in network analysis, you don't have to just look at the gendered and racial classed dimensions of the ties. You can also look at the types of ties that people have, right? There are ways to connect and show this is a strong tie, this is a weak tie, this is a tie that I do to this. I think the ways that people can engage and understand and picture the world of work and the ways in the societies in which they are in, those are the kinds of exercises that seem, at least in my experience, to make a difference to people, because I don't know that individuals, it's deeply difficult to have individuals understand that they are embedded in multiple structures of inequality and power that are racial, gendered, and so forth. That is a very abstract idea if you're not a social scientist or you have not been around enough social science language in the policy, practice, or activist world. It seems really obvious to me, and as an anthropologist who's been an anthropologist, and this is the bread and butter, but explaining it and having people understand what that means, that this is to have a kind of intersectional approach to understanding organizations and what the implications are, is no easy task, even with people that are concerned about inequality in the workplace, right? So what are the tools and techniques that we can use as researchers, activists, and others that help people? And of course, this takes time and money, a certain amount of money for people to have, which I'm not, it's not entirely clear they have, right, all the time in the current environment where people are under so much stress. But, it's how do we engage in multiple ways, pictorially, diagrammically, and otherwise, helping individuals and organizations and the people that lead those organizations on multiple levels, not just at the top, to really understand how organizational structures of power and inequality shape inequity, people's lives, and opportunities.
Thank you very much for the question, Mindy, and for the answer, Melissa. Do we have any more questions from the audience? It's about 1:15, so we close at 1:30.
So I
Any more
just have
questions?
something to share, David. As
Okay.
you know, we've just done the 12th International Critical Management Studies Conference. It was just held in India for the first time. So there, later on, I had some conversations with Stella, and we discussed this thing about, she was looking at a paper of mine, and I just asked her to review it. So this thing came about microaggressions. Now, this is not my idea. This is her idea. And I really think there's a point here. where she said, what is microaggression? Why do we even call it that? So if somebody is racist against you or has been disparaging to you gender-wise, depending on whether it's a small level of pain or a large level of pain, you're still being wronged, isn't it? So just a thought, I'm putting it out there. She feels that the word microaggressions possibly should not be used. Yeah.
I think that's a really important point, because microaggressions puts the emphasis on the individual. And, of course, people, especially when I teach in the United States, although, having taught in Europe, it's not necessarily exclusively the same. People think of, American individualism is alive and well, right? And people do not think of themselves in relation to others and in structures. And so microaggressions puts the emphasis on an individual and not the systemic ways of I don't know, macro. It doesn't show how microaggressions necessarily pile up to be systemic forms of racism and inequality. And, again, I just think that we need more ways of anthropologists, critical management scholars, and others to figure out how to translate ideas from the social sciences and humanities about inequality and society and the workplace in ways that are understandable and make sense to people. Right? Because all this other stuff about unconscious bias and all these things rarely, at least, and I don't spend all my time in diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm not a professional exactly in that domain. But we need to create conversations between social scientists and policymakers. There's a lot of silo busting. My colleague Gillian Tett is an anthropologist who is well known for talking about the importance of busting silos. So, one of the things that I actually think is fabulous right now that I've been participating in is finally having workplace strategists invite business and organizational anthropologists and sociologists to the table. Happening far more, right? And diversity, equity, inclusion officers and technology people to work together. Because one of the things is, none of this can be done in an isolated frame, and none of this can be done organizationally. In one part of an organization without the other. You can't redesign technological ways of virtual hybrid work without involving IT. You can't think about, how you're going to deal with human workplace policies, practices without involving. You need to involve employees at multiple levels. In my imagined wonderful world, the janitors, service workers, and executives are all in the same meeting spaces and things like that. If that can happen, that would be wonderful. I'm not sure that that's entirely likely.
I hope it will happen. And of course, the unions that are part of our umbrella would be interested in extending their reach and improving the prospects for those sorts of settlements. More questions? Thank you very much. More questions from the audience? If not, Melissa, I noticed that you put your email address on the PowerPoint. Are you willing to put it in chat to have people reach out to you if they have questions?
Yes,
So
I'd be happy to continue the conversation offline.
Okay.
I'd be happy
Great.
to, increasingly I'm being asked to work with organizations and workplaces on these issues as a kind of more applied anthropologist. Although my career has been primarily academic for the last 3 decades, I've increasingly moved between, as somebody who's been, my most recent position before coming back to Columbia in New York was as the Lera Sanderson Professor of Business and Organizational Anthropology. And in Denmark, it's really amazing how much anthropologists are part of the fabric of workplaces, shipping yards. It's incredible. And so I'm part of a growing community of anthropologists who really want anthropologists to be far more engaged in helping organizations and workplaces become more diverse, equitable, and inclusive. And I would be happy to talk to people about articles or, ways to work together or how we could work with unions more. That would be an amazing area, I think, for anthropologists to think about initiatives, and sociologists, how we can do that with critical management scholars like David and others that are here on the call.
Thank you, Melissa. And it'd be great if we can have more anthropologists, organizational scholars in DC Lera and National Lera. They can become members. Look at the website, dclera.org or leraweb.org. I put them in the website. Maybe I did, but it's dclera.org, leraweb.org. And any more questions before we close off? We'll go off and have our virtual life. Oh, thank you, Bernadette. That's much clearer. That's very helpful. So I always tell my students that it's time to go off and have lunch. So thank you very much to everybody. We'll be seeing some of you next month, February 16th for Thea Lee. So I guess that's all for now.
And thank you so much for inviting me and the opportunity to speak with everybody. I look forward to being hopefully working with you all in the future.
Thank you very much, Melissa Fisher.
Great talk.
Thank you.